The Industrial Revolution was a time of immense change in Europe, beginning in the late 18th century. It was not a war with soldiers and battles, but a revolution of making things. Before this time, most goods were made by hand in small workshops or at home. The Industrial Revolution introduced new machines powered by steam, water, and coal. These machines could produce goods much faster and in larger quantities than ever before. Factories were built in cities, and people moved from farms to work in them. This period completely transformed how people lived, worked, and thought about the world, creating a new industrial society built on mass production. This new way of making things created a constant and growing hunger for raw materials. The factories of Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany were like giant beasts that needed to be fed. They consumed enormous amounts of cotton for textiles, rubber for tires and industrial parts, and palm oil for lubricating machinery and making soap. European countries soon realized that their own lands could not supply enough of these resources to keep the factories running at full capacity. They needed to look elsewhere to find the vast quantities of raw materials required to sustain their industrial growth and maintain their economic momentum, a search that would soon turn their eyes toward the vast and resource-rich continent of Africa. At the same time, these factories were producing more goods than the people in Europe could buy. This created a problem of overproduction. Factory owners and national governments needed to find new places to sell their manufactured products, such as textiles, tools, and household items. Africa, with its large population, was seen as a huge, untapped market. The idea was simple. Take raw materials from Africa at low costs, turn them into finished products in European factories, and then sell these products back to African consumers at a profit. This economic cycle promised to make European nations incredibly wealthy and powerful, creating a compelling reason to establish direct control over African territories. Before the Industrial Revolution, European contact with most of Africa was limited to coastal trading posts. The interior of the continent was largely unknown to them, often called the Dark Continent simply because of their ignorance. But the economic pressures created by industrialization changed this relationship dramatically. The need for resources and markets was no longer a simple commercial interest. It became a national imperative. This drive for economic dominance would soon merge with feelings of national pride and a misguided sense of cultural superiority, setting the stage for a period of intense colonization known as the Scramble for Africa, where European powers would race to claim parts of the continent for themselves. The technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution were the very tools that made the colonization of Africa possible. One of the most important inventions was the steam engine. Steam-powered ships, or steamboats, could travel up African rivers like the Niger and the Congo, which were difficult to navigate with sailing ships because of unpredictable currents and winds. This allowed Europeans to move deep into the interior of the continent for the first time, reaching areas that had been previously inaccessible. Steamships could carry soldiers, supplies, and administrators far from the coast, enabling the projection of power and the establishment of inland bases for control and trade. Railways were another key technology that facilitated conquest and control. Once a territory was claimed, Europeans built railway lines that connected the resource-rich interior to the coastal ports. These railways were not built to benefit African communities or to connect existing African towns. Instead, their primary purpose was to extract raw materials, such as minerals and agricultural products, as efficiently as possible. A train could transport tons of rubber, cotton, or copper to a port in a fraction of the time it would take using traditional methods. The railways became iron arteries, pumping the lifeblood of Africa's resources directly to the industries of Europe. Advances in military technology gave Europeans an overwhelming advantage in any conflict. While many African societies had their own armies and weapons, they could not compete with the new firearms produced in European factories. The Maxim gun, an early machine gun invented in the 1880s, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. A small group of European soldiers armed with such weapons could defeat a much larger African force armed with older guns or traditional weapons like spears. This military superiority made armed resistance incredibly difficult and costly for African peoples, allowing European powers to conquer vast territories with relatively few casualties on their side. Finally, medical breakthroughs also played a crucial role. For centuries, diseases like malaria had killed many Europeans who tried to venture into the African interior, giving the continent the nickname, the white man's grave. During the 19th century, scientists discovered that quinine, a medicine derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, could be used to prevent and treat malaria. This discovery allowed European soldiers, officials, and missionaries to survive in tropical regions for extended periods. With the threats of disease and geography greatly reduced by technology, the path was clear for a full-scale invasion and occupation of the African continent. The arrival of European colonizers brought profound and often devastating changes to the structure of African societies. Before colonization, Africa was a continent of thousands of diverse political and social groups, ranging from large, centralized empires to small, decentralized communities. The colonizers ignored these existing structures. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, European powers drew lines on a map to divide the continent among themselves, creating new countries with artificial borders. These borders often cut through existing ethnic or cultural groups, lumping rival communities together into a single colony while separating others. This disregard for local realities created deep-seated tensions that would last long after the colonial period ended. Economically, colonization reshaped African lands to serve the needs of European industries. Subsistence farming, where people grew food for themselves and their communities, was often replaced by cash crop agriculture. Africans were forced or heavily taxed to grow crops like cotton, cocoa, or coffee, which were then exported to Europe. This focus on cash crops meant that less land and labor were available for growing food, sometimes leading to severe food shortages and famines. Furthermore, Africans were often forced to work in mines or on plantations under brutal conditions for very low wages, a system that amounted to forced labor, enriching European companies while impoverishing local populations. The social fabric of African life was also fundamentally altered. Colonial administrators often imposed their own systems of law and governance, undermining the authority of local chiefs and traditional rulers. In some cases, they would empower one ethnic group over others to help them rule, a strategy known as divide and rule, which created further conflict and resentment. Christian missionaries also spread throughout the continent, and while they introduced Western education and medicine, they also sought to replace traditional African beliefs and cultural practices with European ones. This created a cultural clash and a sense of inferiority among many Africans, who were taught that their own heritage was savage or backward. Land ownership was another area of drastic change. In many African societies, land was held communally and could not be bought or sold. The colonizers introduced the concept of private property, and vast tracts of the most fertile land were taken from Africans and given to white settlers or European companies. This dispossession of land not only robbed people of their livelihoods, but also struck at the heart of their cultural and spiritual identity, as land was often deeply connected to ancestry and community. The loss of land forced many Africans into the wage labor economy, working for the very people who had taken their ancestral homes. In summary, the Industrial Revolution was the engine that powered Europe's colonization of Africa. It created an insatiable demand for raw materials and new markets, which European nations sought to satisfy by conquering and controlling the African continent. The very technologies that transformed Europe, steamships, railways, advanced weaponry, and medicines, provided the means to overcome geographical and biological barriers, enabling a swift and total conquest. This process was not a peaceful exchange but a violent imposition of foreign rule that fundamentally reshaped the course of history for both continents, setting them on dramatically different paths of development and power. For Europe, colonization was a source of immense wealth and global power. The resources extracted from Africa fueled further industrial growth, enriched national treasuries, and raised the standard of living for many people in the colonizing countries. The possession of vast overseas empires became a symbol of national greatness and prestige. This period cemented Europe's position at the center of the global political and economic system. The profits and power gained during the colonial era gave European nations a significant head start in the modern world, the effects of which are still visible today in global economic disparities. For Africa, the consequences of colonization were profoundly negative and long-lasting. The continent's economic development was distorted to serve European interests, creating a legacy of dependency on exporting raw materials. The political legacy includes artificial borders that continue to fuel ethnic conflicts and political instability in many modern African nations. Socially, colonization disrupted traditional structures, devalued local cultures, and introduced deep-seated inequalities. The experience of colonial rule left a legacy of trauma, economic underdevelopment, and political challenges that African nations are still working to overcome more than a century later. The relationship forged during this era defined the modern world. The wealth of one continent was built upon the exploitation of another, creating a deep and enduring imbalance of power. Understanding how the Industrial Revolution fueled colonization is essential to understanding not only the history of the 19th century, but also the present-day realities of global politics, economics, and the ongoing quest for justice and equality. The story of colonization is a stark reminder of how technological progress, when combined with unchecked greed and a sense of superiority, can be used as a tool for domination rather than for the shared benefit of all humanity.